Hello friends, welcome back. In this short video lesson, we shall be looking at the word health. Health really is not something that we can define in a few words. It is a complex metaphor, and our whole life revolves around it. This complexity is best captured by these words by Jadad and Grady in their editorial of the British Medical Journal. They say, defining health may be futile since a definition may not capture its complexity. So let us look at health from this point of view.
Most of us associate health with certain health parameters. There are a lot of numbers that most of you will be familiar with. There is blood pressure, there is heart rate, we have blood sugar values, and so on and so forth. Essentially, these measurements come under a generic term of anthropometry. We have numbers relating to physical size, and in fact, even the intellectual capacity can be measured by certain tests. But to be honest, uh, what these measurements do is really an oversimplification in our quest to define health. Now, where did all this really begin? All these measurements to be adapted for medical purposes started somewhere towards the end of the 19th century. And the person who was really responsible for that was a very intelligent and highly respected person whose name was Adolphe Quetelet. He was a Belgian astronomer, scientist, and philosopher. And during the time when there was a revolution going on against the Dutch rule of Belgium, he came up with the idea of measuring everything that was of concern to a human being, including sociology, physical parameters, and so many other things. And that became the science of anthropometry. As a matter of fact, even today, we use the body mass index, the BMI, and this particular number was derived by Quetelet, which is still in use today. So a body mass index is one particular measurement which is taken into consideration by dietitians, doctors, and so many other health consultants. But it's really not as simple as that, because health is not just the status when all the parameters are within normal ranges. Today, there are more than 200 health parameters that can be measured. And if we were to plot all these parameters on a bell curve, you're familiar with the Poisson's distribution, then if we were to say that the middle 5% represent the norm or the normal value, then if we were to consider 200 such values, you will soon discover that there won't be a single person left who will not be unhealthy. So those are the limitations of measurement of health in terms of parameters and establishing norms. Health is not just the sum of norms, and we shall explore this to some extent during this lesson. Another problem is that a lot of terms which were used by medical practitioners are today seen in the light of being unscientific. For example, suffering. Nobody likes to use the word suffering anymore because it is seen in a religious or moral context. Same thing applies to the word healing. These are no more considered as scientific words. They're considered old-fashioned, and in fact, they have a connotation of being clinically important because you cannot do anything about suffering. Suffering is so personal, so internal, so subjective, and we are very comfortable when it comes to measurement and numbers. So if something is not measurable, does it not qualify to be of any concern to the medical practitioner or to the individual? Likewise, who establishes a norm? What exactly is normal? Is it just some statistical average or mean? So these things had been considered at length, and I would recommend all of you to read this book or excerpts of this book at some point of time And the name of this book is On the Normal and the Pathological. What is normal, or who determines that, and what should be considered pathological or in a state of disease? And the writer of this book is Georges Canguilhem. Let's see what he has to say. This author tells us that there is no normal or abnormal state of health. And the justifications can be found in this book, and I encourage all of you to have a look at that. Further, health is not something definable statistically. Health is the ability to adapt to one's environment. So if you can adapt to a certain environment, then that is a sign of health. For example, people who live in Tibet, which is a very high plateau above the Himalayas, or who are living, for example, in Bolivia. People who live over there for their lifetime will normally be having very high count of red blood cells and hemoglobin. It's remarkably high. In fact, it would be considered a disease state if you were living at the sea level. That is what is meant by adapting to one's environment. This is an adaptation by the body in order to stay fit, in order to achieve the goals of your life, and in order to meet the expectations that you have about yourself and what you wish to do about it. Further, health is not a fixed entity. Finally, health varies for every individual, and health depends on circumstances, as we saw in the case of people living in very high plateaus or high altitudes like Bolivia, Tibet, and other such places. So we must keep this in mind when we are talking about definitions of health, and we must take the physical parameters with a pinch of salt and understanding when it comes to looking at those parameters. We'll take another example, which is the white blood cell count per microliter. This is a very standard test that people undergo when they're suspected of having an infection. 100 years ago, it was considered normal to have at least a minimum of 10,000 white blood cells per microliter of blood to a maximum of 12,000. So the range which was considered normal was 10 to 12,000. Today, the numbers are 4,000 and 10,000. So today's maximum was a minimum which was considered minimum 100 years ago. Now, how is that? What exactly has happened? We must understand that 100 years ago, there was no vaccination and infectious disease were rampant. As a matter of fact, it is said that during the end of the 19th century, that means in the late 1890s and early 1900s, almost a third of the adult population of Germany was infected with tuberculosis. In a very advanced society which had very high standards of hygiene as well as medicine. Even so, the infectious diseases were very rampant. By contrast, today, not only do we have vaccinations, we have better conditions of hygiene in our homes and in public spaces, and infectious diseases are quite uncommon. So these two together have changed the norm from a minimum of 10,000 to a maximum of 12,000 to the new figure, which is between 4 to 10,000. Here is a summary of what appeared in the Lancet magazine on the topic of health. It has a long string of discussion, which once again I'll encourage you to explore. The reference is given here, and this was published in the month of March, year 2009. And what we find is that when we consider any definition of health, it must encompass complex determinants of illness. Everyone does not fall sick to the same infecting germ. There are so many other conditions which include environment, a person's individuality, which we shall be considering later when we do a topic on etiology of disease and sickness, social conditions, and so many other things, and above all, the constitution of a person, which will also be considered later in the course. Any definition of health must include animate and inanimate environment. Further, physical, mental, and social dimensions of life must be taken into consideration when we are trying to define health. It cannot be defined universally. It must make adjustments and compensations for all these factors. And most importantly, we must put the individual patient and not the doctor in a position to determine the definition of his or her health needs. So it's the person who matters more than a doctor who happens to see the patient as just another number or statistic. A very important paper, and please explore that whenever you have the time. That brings us to the end of this lesson, and I shall just summarize briefly what we have discussed. Health, when it comes to defining it, is not just a matter of a sentence or a paragraph. It is a complex metaphor, quite individualized. It is not about norms, even though norms can help us in diagnosing a disease or in measuring the progress of a disease or cure or the direction of cure and so many other things, but definitely it cannot be the only means of determining health. Health is also about adaptation. How a person adapts to a changing environment, whether it is social or whether it is environmental, any such thing. Adaptation and the degree and speed of adaptation is a better measure of health. And finally, health is also the ability of a person to adapt the environment, the ability to change the environment to one's benefit. Thank you very much for your attention and see you in the next video. Meanwhile, please participate on the forum by posting your comments, your questions, observations, and experiences. Thank you very much and bye-bye.